Hey, what's going on guys? It's Comrade Stakey, and today I'm going to be talking about Square Enix and Final Fantasy VII. Now, if you're like me and you're a big fan of Final Fantasy VII, then do I have some good news for you. Today, some trademarks have been found about, well, some more Final Fantasy VII projects from Square Enix. Now, Square Enix has recently just released Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, and I can say in full confidence that the next part of the remake will probably not be out for a couple of years. However, if you're okay with the wait, then I gotta admit there are some definite things to look forward to given this new information. Square Enix has filed multiple trademarks, and they all have pretty interesting connotation to them. One of those is the First Soldier, which, is a lot to do with Sephiroth. Now, what could this mean? Well, it could have something to do with Crisis Core, or it could be something entirely new, which is going to be centered around Sephiroth. Now, Square Enix has definitely not had any problem making movies. It seems to be a route that they're okay with doing. They did it with 15, they did it with 7, though they might do it again with 7. It's a possibility. So there could be a movie based around Sephiroth, but what I do think is more likely is either a DLC that will, center around Sephiroth on the current Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I'm not sure about that. Square Enix has been kind of silent about Final Fantasy VII Remake ever since its launch, especially with Final Fantasy 16 right around the corner. So this being the first soldier and being based around Sephiroth, I don't know if it's going to be a standalone thing or if it's going to be tacked on to Final Fantasy VII Remake. Is kind of something to bide the time for the next part to come. Or, like I said, they could pull another Advent Children or Kingsglaive and make a whole movie based on Sephiroth, which, given his notoriety and, popularity among the fandom and in media in general, especially with his recent inclusion into Smash, it seems that there is enough, interest in him for them to make a project solely based around them, and they seem to be perfectly fine with that. However, another thing this could be is just, preemptive trademarks that might signal, a extended name for the remake. What I mean by that is recently, in interviews, it's been said that Final Fantasy VII Remake going forward won't be specifically titled Final Fantasy Remake Part 2, but it'll be Final Fantasy VII and then whatever working title they're with at the time. These could simply be working titles. For example, Final Fantasy Remake Part 2 could be called Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but it's just a possibility. But there's a lot of different routes. But one thing that we can be happy about is there are more Final Fantasy VII related trademarks, which is always something good to hear, because with all the stuff that Square Enix is working on right now, with Final Fantasy 16, Final Fantasy 14 getting an expansion, Project Athia, and Nier, hearing anything about another project related to Final Fantasy VII, aside from just the remake, is always great news. The next listed trademark was Ever Crisis. Now, unlike the First Soldier, which is directly referencing Sephiroth, I believe that Ever Crisis is more likely to be one or two things. Now, I think that it's very possible that Ever Crisis will be the title of the next Final Fantasy remake. I think that it will be Final Fantasy VII Remake Ever Crisis rather than Part 2, because it has been, there's been a few interviews where they've talked about they've not wanted to use that terminology going forward. But there is another thing for those more hopeful and wanting to see more Zack, and that is that Ever Crisis may either be something related to Zack, kind of like his own DLC, or an entire remake of Crisis Core offloaded to another studio that isn't Square Enix, or just a smaller branch of Square Enix, just given, how many different projects they're working on currently, as it would be a little bit unrealistic for them to have a full-scale Crisis Core remake in the middle of, Final Fantasy 16, 14, Project Athia, and Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. There's just so much going on, and they've already had struggles to, push out the content that they need to push out as is. But there is the potential for it to either be a DLC, or if they did make an entire new game out of it, it would, like I said, be offloaded to another company. But, that couldn't be that doesn't necessarily mean it would be bad, but, we'll see what happens. But the obvious good out of that is the fact that, there is a trademark out. I think that the more likely option is Ever Crisis will be the name of Part 2, but I may be wrong. It might be something related to, a side piece of content, supplementary content, just something to, I guess, hold the fans over, because it's very clear that there will probably be some pretty hefty gaps between each portion of the remake. I believe it's a trilogy, but there hasn't even been confirmation of that yet. They could drag this thing out for more than 3. I hope not, because I do not want to be, an old man by the time this is finished, but, we will see what happens. The last one is going to be a little bit anticlimactic, simply because it's just the Shinra logo. This is probably more business related rather than something to do with an entirely different project. But as far as the trademarks go, those 3 things are the major trademarks that have been found that they have currently, listed and had something to do with currently. As far as a release window for all these things go, I would say that for the foreseeable future, Final Fantasy XVI and Project Athia are going to be the front runners. That's going to be the thing of most import to Square Enix. They might, it mainly just depends on what these things specifically are. If it's a movie or a full-on standalone game, I would say that it's more likely to be farther out, maybe along the lines of 2022 at the end, or 2023. But if they're DLC, then we could see something much sooner. It just simply depends on how they're handling, their development team. I don't know who's being put on what. Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 is already in development, has been for a little bit, so that team will obviously have their hands full with that work, so it just depends on where they would put each specific thing. Square Enix is known for putting out a lot of content. Sometimes they have release issues here and there, but they're definitely known for having a large amount of content on a wide scale of different series and whatnot. I mean, even this year they're releasing another Nier game, so there's definitely a lot to look forward to if you're a Square Enix fan rather than just a specific series fan. But I would say that the most likely situation is 2023 will be the release of the second part of the remake, whether it's using one of these trademarks as a name or if there's going to be supplementary content beforehand, which I find a little doubtful. I believe that this supplementary content is kind of just getting trademarked and prepared in advance. I believe the most likely time period that we would see that stuff is after 2023. I could see it being used after Part 2. Like, for example, Part 2 comes out and they have a long development period again for Part 3. I could see, something relating to Crisis Core or Sephiroth coming out in between, just to kind of hold people over. So they have something Final Fantasy VII related to play and consume until the, hopefully, final installment of the remake series will come out. But yeah, so as far as Final Fantasy VII goes and information regarding that, that's about all I have currently. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you liked it, awesome. In the comments, maybe give me some heads up on if there's any Final Fantasy VII content you specifically are excited for. What do you think is going to come from these trademarks? Do you think it's going to be a Crisis Core remake, or do you think it's going to be something entirely different? I'd love to know. But aside from that, I hope you all have a great day, and thank you for watching.